Good afternoon. I am Matthew Piepenburg. I'm a partner at the Zurich-based von Greyerz AG, and it is a very unique pleasure and honor today to have Doomberg from the highly respected and successful Substack Doomberg of the same name to join me today, March 13th, 2025, for a discussion really on energy themes in the backdrop of current headlines, kind of media distortions, evolving events in the Ukraine, China, and elsewhere. So, Doomberg, thank you very much for joining me today.
Matthew, very much looking forward to a fantastic discussion.
Well, listen, Doomberg, you are much, much more than an anonymous green chicken leading the Substack space in your insights on how energy impacts really politics, economics, and society at large. And it's really wonderful when one loves what one does and is not constrained in any way with their thinking by a large organization. And when you love what you do, as you've said elsewhere, you don't really have to go to work because it's really not work. And I think also you having a very deep industry background and perspective in the energy space adds a great deal of weight and credibility to your perspective. And I think, as does the importance of being guided really by what you say is economics and physics, i.e., the laws of entropy. I've always looked more to credit history and economics than daily market trends to kind of conclude that eventually debt and credit expansion from the realpolitik of what I call economic colonization by banks kind of determines the march of history and the eventual policies and currency debasement and centralization, which always kind of follows. I'm thinking of the 18th century philosopher and mathematician David Hume, who said that debt destroys nations. And I'm really curious to see how and where debt-based and energy-based perspectives kind of overlap and where and how they are misunderstood. But that would be probably a much longer discussion. But as to the matter of misunderstanding in the energy space, I really want to address the mainstream media and its kind of energy blind climate agenda first. And months back, I had written an article about some of the things that were destroying America. And one of the themes I'd written about was in the current American setting, there are five large mega media corporations which effectively control 99% of the mainstream media. And in the 1980s, there were 50 companies. And so I see that kind of consolidation and control of information as, again, a monopolization, kind of a centralization. And this mainstream and highly politicized and concentrated media has done an exceptional job over the years of discrediting and debasing itself, having long ago, I think, prioritized ideological narratives over factual debate or interesting dialogue. And as you have said before, this media kind of feeds red meat to the left and the right, depending on their agenda and target audience. I think nowhere is as clear than in the public's narrative and treatment of the quote unquote energy transition, which you speak a lot about. And the West's push for kind of a net zero policies and renewables seems a lot more of form over substance. That is more virtue signaling than a kind of physics-based strategy. And the media approach kind of disregards the hard constraints like energy density and intermittency and infrastructure costs. And I think that by ignoring these realities, I understand what I feel is your belief that the West has made itself tragically what you call energy blind, which is very important. So to get to my question, Doomberg, and it's kind of a two-part question. Why does the mainstream media push a politically convenient but potentially unrealistic energy transition meme? And how does this manufactured consensus kind of undermine the West's long-term energy security while countries like China, India, and others remain indifferent to such rhetoric?
So lots to unpack there, obviously, but at the highest level, I think the most important thing that I heard you say, which I agree with, is this media monopoly, which has come to dominate the discourse in the West. If you have a monopoly on information, you can tell a lie for a very long time.
Yes.
But one of the challenges with telling a lie is eventually people begin to realize the truth. And the longer you hold on to a lie, the more discredited you become. And eventually something has to give, because in the battle between platitudes and physics, physics is undefeated. So if we go back to your concept about debt, explaining the economy, we would view debt as a derivative of currency and currency as an overlay onto fundamental energy transactions. And you're essentially spending energy and paying for it later. And energy is life is a fundamental axiom of our analysis. So your standard of living, my standard of living, the standard of living of everybody listening to this is defined by how much energy you get to waste.
Right.
And I use the word waste on purpose because you cannot impose order on your local environment without wasting heat.
Mm-hmm.
The second law of thermodynamics is bedrock of scientific axioms.
Mm-hmm.
And so rich people get to waste a lot of energy, and poor people don't get to waste a lot of energy, and everybody everywhere likes to be richer.
Mm-hmm.
And the great lie, parroted by the media for years, is not whether climate change is real or not. Climate change is, we're burning a lot of hydrocarbons. We're certainly impacting the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. CO2 in the atmosphere impacts the climate. I can agree that all of those things are interesting hypotheses to debate. The big lie that has been sold is that we could do something about it with no meaningful sacrifice,
Right.
which is just untrue, provably untrue. There are other slightly smaller lies, but still gigantic lies, like renewables are cheap, for example.
Right.
These are provable lies, knowing lies, actually, by the people in many instances who propagate them. But the biggest lie of them all is that if you just put a few solar panels on your roof and your third car is an electric vehicle, we can meaningfully alter the climate in predictable ways. The only way to meaningfully reduce carbon emissions is to radically reduce people's standard of livings,
Right.
or to have far less people on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And why we've told ourselves these lies and why the media has held on to them for so long is a fascinating story. I can't say that I fully understand it, but it has certainly, for example, directly led to the emergence of Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
The reactionary populist movements that have won in the US and that are currently in the process of being smothered in Europe are a natural consequence of the following fundamental truism of humanity. On the path from abundance to starvation is riot.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, what we're seeing is a series of political riots
Mm-hmm.
in Europe, and we're not that far away from a series of violent riots
Mm-hmm.
in Europe. And so, final point I would make is, as you pointed out at the top of your question, we come from industry, and 4 years ago, when we noticed sort of this developing debate in the energy world, we observed that there was actually no voices from industry participating in it, mostly because successful people in the industry are hidden behind public affairs teams and investor relations teams and deathly afraid of being canceled.
Right.
And so that was the inefficiency in the market that Doomberg sought to occupy when we launched 4 years ago. And I think now there are others doing it. There's certainly voices before, but we sort of managed to create an audience on the growing platform that is Substack.
Mm-hmm.
And we've succeeded beyond our wildest imaginations because when everyone is lying to you, the truth is very seductive. And we
Right.
try to tell the truth. We are fact-based, not afraid to be wrong, freely admit it when we are. And our audience knows that whatever we publish is authentically our belief 100% the moment we press send.
Right. Right.
We're not writing for clicks
Right.
or tricks. We're writing to entertain, to inform, and to educate. And I think our audience believes that authentically.
No, the credibility is very apparent. I want to ask you though at that point. It's a very important point that you make. That climate change is real, and it is, I suppose, solvable, but not without meaningful sacrifice. That is the big lie. And I'm wondering, and again, maybe we don't have all the answers. Again, this complicity versus stupidity debate of the quote unquote powers that be. The media we know is stupid. The average pundit, talking head, Ken and Barbie hasn't really taken an econ course and couldn't look under the hood of anything very deeply. But behind that is, it seems, behind those media kind of Ken and Barbies that are pundit, I guess you'd call prompt readers, really. We can forgive that type of stupidity, but there seems to be complicitly and deliberately ignoring what you've said is the meaningful sacrifice it would cost, because we do need energy, or if we want to have a better climate, we could get that, but that would be a massive cut in demand and a massive cut in the standard of living for wealthy economies like the American or Canadian economies. And certainly American and Canadian politicians must know that as well. And yet they keep pushing, with the help, it seems, of the media, this narrative that ESG is the answer, that we need to change the world to be cleaner for the climate, when they don't really mean it. Is that me being too sensational, or is there something deeper there?
Well, there's actually a deeper dimension to the big lie that I think informs on the specifics of your question. So let me get that out.
Hmm.
The second element of the big lie is, the big lie is that we can't meaningfully reduce carbon emissions without radically reducing standards of living. The sort of corollary to that is that not everyone's going to do it. And so anything that we forego in the
Right.
form of energy consumption is going to be greedily picked up by China, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Brazil, the
Hmm.
so-called global south.
Right.
And and in fact, we developed what we call Doomberg's postulate, which states that every molecule of fossil fuel produced worldwide will be burned by somebody somewhere,
Hmm.
and local restrictions against such activities merely shift who gets to enjoy that privilege.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so the gating function of carbon emissions is not actually consumption, it's production.
Mm, interesting.
And the vast majority of production of fossil fuels occurs in the US and then in a bunch of countries that don't care about climate change. So
Right.
Europe, for example, produces 0.5% of the world's oil and a percent and change of the world's natural gas. The European Union, I'm talking about, the
Hmm.
27 member states of the European Union.
Yep.
Nobody cares how they drive around or how they heat their homes because they're meaningless
Hmm.
on the parameter that matters most, which is the production of fossil fuels. Whereas
Hmm.
China produces half the world's coal and burns even more.
Hmm.
The coal is the economic foundation of China's quote unquote economic miracle, which is not surprising. Ready access and reliable access to dirt cheap energy is the foundation of wealth.
Right.
And it's just not that hard, right? And so the US is the world's largest energy producer. We produce 20% of the world's oil, almost 30% of the world's natural gas. We're sitting on the world's largest coal reserves. We're a stupendously wealthy country
Hmm.
for that reason. The
Hmm.
sidewalks in Saudi Arabia are paved with gold because energy is life, energy is wealth.
Yep.
Debt and currency are how we distribute and optimize that wealth that is born from energy.
Hmm.
But it's the energy that matters. And when dislocations get big enough, you need the jewels, right?
Right.
And so that's where the sort of the quantum wave function collapses and reality imposes itself, which Europe found out the hard way during the energy crisis. So now, with that background, why do the Western pundits, the Ken and Barbies, as you call them,
Hmm.
uh, uh, are most of them intellectually, subpar, let's say, to use
Hmm.
a kind phrase,
Politely.
um, and then controlled by a few truly evil people? I, I don't know. Um, when I look at such situations, the first question I ask is who has benefited. So the
Right.
country that has benefited the most from, at least until the recent years, the country that had benefited the most from Europe's maniacal focus on carbon emissions was Russia.
Hmm.
Europe
Hmm.
banned fracking. Europe
Hmm.
shut down its nuclear power plants, and Europe became utterly dependent on Russia for its energy needs.
Hmm.
And when the war in Ukraine broke out, which I think in part was driven by Putin's miscalculation about the leverage that this gave him, I think he underestimated the willingness of the European leaders to impale themselves
Right.
um,
Yep.
on the energy altar
Yep.
to rapidly deindustrialize. It's such an insane reaction to what happened that he didn't even probably conceive it on the board of options.
Right.
And so this is how we are where we are. Europe is
Hmm.
rapidly deindustrializing. Russia's winning the war,
Yep.
and they still haven't sort of realized what's going on.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so in the US, the biggest beneficiary is China.
Hmm.
So if you told me in 20 years that historians figured out that the environmental movement was funded by Russia in Europe and funded by China in North America, would I be shocked? No.
Hmm.
Am I saying that's what happened? No, but it's a useful working model that fits the
Hmm.
data so far, right? I mean, when
Hmm.
you have a small number of companies that influence discourse, um, you have point sources of control where small pulls on a lever can have significant impact,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And by the way, I think this explains the explosion in alternative media sources like Substack,
Hmm.
like Doomberg.
Hmm.
Um, People know what they're getting when they watch Fox News. This is what the deep state wants conservatives to hear today.
Right.
And they know what they're getting when they watch the CBC. This is what the families that control Canada want the people
Right.
to hear. I mean, I
Hmm.
laugh at my many Canadian friends who think that there's a difference between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party. They all have the same bosses. I mean,
Right.
let's not kid it. Do
Yeah.
you think the Irving family cares who's in charge of New Brunswick? I mean, the Irving family is in charge of New Brunswick. This is not
Yeah.
some
Yeah. It's
big
fascinating.
conspiracy.
It's fascinating. I mean, I call it two stirrups on the same saddle, left and
Yeah,
right media. But it
and
is a,
and
yeah.
we just wrote a piece potentially implying that Trump is doing their bidding by making sure that Carney wins the upcoming election. I mean,
Yeah.
you can go down the rabbit holes. We enjoy the occasional bit of tinfoil thinking, but at the
No,
same
I
time,
understand, but oh, what a twisted web we weave when we practice to deceive. And yet, again, we're not saying we know this, but it's a very interesting argument and possible theory that Russia benefits the most from ESG and key bono is Russia. And it's an interesting thing. I don't think you're pretending to say you know that for a fact, but it does kind of connect some dots without being authoritative on it. But it's fascinating. So it's an interesting way of looking at it, for certain. And I do want to talk about Russia and the Ukraine in a little bit later. But as we go back to these themes that we started with and the big lies that you can solve climate change or the climate problem without but not without meaningful sacrifice. One country that you've mentioned is China, which is a major oil importer but a major coal user, certainly isn't interested in making any meaningful sacrifices on climate change. I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of China's realpolitik energy strategy versus the West in the context of what you've been saying, because I think China does understand, as you would say, that energy is power, and Beijing pursues a fairly pragmatic, security-first approach, largely indifferent to Western climate rhetoric. Its policies reflect a kind of hard strategic realism, I would say. And I look at example at coal expansion. I mean, despite global net zero talk, China is adding more coal-fired capacity than the European Union's entire grid. And from China, we are seeing this kind of hydrocarbons first approach. They're securing oil and gas via the Belt and Road investments in Russia, Africa, the Middle East, et cetera. Or just stated more simply, it appears China bluntly follows energy security over ESG, and it has no real illusions about green utopias kind of undermining its competitiveness. And so, Doomberg, what I guess I'm asking you is, what does China see rightly or wrongly that the West is either ignoring or not saying out loud? And how can China's energy realism translate into more economic and military supremacy for China over time versus the West? And that's a
great.
long, that's a loaded question, but I know it's
Well, luckily for the audience, last August we produced a 45-minute webinar
Mhm.
called "The Year of the Dragon: China Through the Lens of Energy," where we took apart this very question in great detail. And if
Mhm.
anybody listening wants a free copy, maybe I'll send you a magic
That'd be
link to that
fantastic.
webinar, and
Yeah,
you could
I would love to look at that for myself.
and if anybody reaches out to you and asks for a free copy, you can
Okay,
give it to them as well.
fantastic.
China is brilliant in its energy strategy. By the way, China is mostly energy independent. You correctly identified they have one overarching weakness, which is a lack of oil,
Yep.
which they're actively working to close, which we can talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But they have compensated for that by becoming the dominant refiner in
Mm-hmm.
Asia.
Mm-hmm.
They have as much or more of refining capacity than the US, depending on which set of numbers you look at, which means all of their neighbors are dependent on China successfully procuring its oil.
Right. Interesting.
Um, and they burn twice as many exajoules as the US
Mm-hmm.
already.
Yep.
They emit far more carbon than the rest of the world. They, in fact, emit almost 4 times as much carbon dioxide equivalent emissions than the US does. But on an energy consumption per capita basis, China is roughly 40% of the average US citizen. So it just gives you a sense of how much further they're going to go.
Right.
There is no hope of meaningfully bending the slope of carbon emissions growth, let alone reducing carbon emissions,
Mm-hmm.
with China pursuing its current energy strategy. And they have indicated zero willingness or concern for carbon emissions. And they're actually executing not just a hydrocarbon agenda, they're executing the world's largest build out of nuclear power.
Mm-hmm.
They are installing some wind and solar, I think mostly because they have monopoly positions in those supply chains and they're happy to pretend like they're important.
Correct.
And they allow, they trick the rest of the West to, fill out those plants that they've built. Look, every
Right.
solar panel on Earth, basically, it's not much of an exaggeration, is built by cheap thermal coal
Hmm.
and has at least some products of forced labor in them
Right.
because 40% of the ignit manufacturing or whatever, if you just look at polysilicon to ignit to wafers to cells, roughly 40% of China's polysilicon supply chain
Hmm.
um, is in the region that the West has accused China of executing a forced labor strategy. And it all gets commingled, right? And so you can't really say that that atom is clean.
Well,
Put it this way.
that's the dark
Yeah.
skunk in the woodpile, isn't it? The dark irony then, if we're
Yes, of
optically
course.
promoting solar energy and yet the components and the labor behind it is either slave labor or environmentally hazardous water runoffs and from
Yeah,
materials and supply chain products coming out of China. It's great irony.
of course. Yes. And so, and that's all fine. Having competed against China in the solar market during my industrial career, I can tell you that they were ruthless.
Yeah.
And ironically, like all of these big Western companies who have the shiniest booths at COP meetings, their procurement teams didn't care. I remember a conversation I had with a very prominent B2C company in the West that you would recognize that I won't name.
Hmm.
And I explained that our competitors had stolen our technology, our competitors in China. And it's difficult to compete when your competitor's view of a water treatment plant is a pipeline to the river.
Yeah, exactly.
And this procurement professional who was sitting in front of a request for proposal said, look, that's for the courts to decide. Meet their price or lose the business.
Yeah, classic,
And
classic.
we lost the business because
Yeah,
it was below our cost of capital.
right.
We would have destroyed shareholder value to continue to remain in that business.
Hmm.
And by the way, then you go to the COP meeting and you see their shiny booth and you see their CEO on CNBC,
Right,
proudly proclaiming their sustainability bona fides. And then you think, okay, this is all just a bunch of you know what.
right, right,
And
right.
so, and by the way, nobody wants to criticize China in this regard because they're all deathly afraid of losing access to the great mirage of growth that is the Chinese domestic market.
Hmm. Hmm.
No major Western company makes a ton of money in China. And if they do, they can't get it out. I mean, it's just, but chasing growth, quarterly numbers,
Right,
executive stock options, Wall Street demands have
right.
all driven this perfect storm that at every turn benefits China. So, um,
It is interesting. That's your industry perspective in a sense that adds so much weight to your views. I mean, the contradictions and ironies abound, to your point of chasing growth and stock options behind the so-called ESG narrative. There's so many skunks in that woodpile that just don't jibe with the narrative.
and look, if you're an executive compensated with options, I mean, not to get too deep in the weeds, but all you really care about is that your stock has high volatility
Precisely. Yeah.
because you get a new batch of options every year. If the higher the beta of your stock, the richer you will be as
Hmm.
an executive. It's
Hmm.
just so,
Yep.
if you are going to, I like to say, ethical incrementalism, if you're going to once you learn how to steal a penny on quarterly earnings, stealing a nickel and a dime and a quarter becomes easier. And once you sort of submit to the pressures of meeting Wall Street expectations, just look at what happened at BlackRock,
Yep.
and the boomerang
Yeah.
that befell Mr. Fink,
Yeah.
who was at one point the literal face of ESG on Wall Street.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Now,
so,
Fink is
yeah,
fascinating to me as a realpolitik capitalist in the sense that he has no friends or enemies or even virtues. He just has goals, and his goal is ROI in a sense and wealth. And 3 years ago, I'm not trying to get off topic, but even Bitcoin was a scam to him 3 years ago. And since then, he's got a $50 billion Bitcoin ETF. And
oh, it's a fee machine now. Yeah,
it's
right?
it's just fascinating. Again, get past the optics, get past the feel good, warm and fuzzies. And if you look under the hood of almost any industry, including energy, you see what you have seen in your background, a lot of contradictions. I want to ask you too, as we're sticking on this point on China, because you said, China is energy independent, except in oil, which is an interesting, and it's leading in refineries, and yet this energy affecting all things, as you rightly noted, has an impact on geopolitics and trade. And yes, it is a major oil importer, but its best oil exporter is right there in Russia, which we've just sanctioned in the last few years. And is now, and this kind of overlaps, and I don't want to go into the gold space. This is really an energy discussion, but we have noticed that, Russia has no problem selling oil to China for yuan and then using that yuan to buy products that were once made in America in China. And then any delta in the difference in price, they convert to gold, and then they convert that in the Shanghai exchange into rubles. So Russia and China have found a way to purchase energy outside of the US dollar, which has massive ramifications for the dollar and the currency longer term and the petrodollar. I don't want to go far down that road, but it is fascinating to see how oil, in this case, is a major geopolitical part of the currency story and the debt story. And I'm just trying to show how these Venn diagrams overlap. But China does seem to be playing chess along with Russia, while the West plays checkers with optics. What do you think of that comment?
Look, the great catastrophe of the Ukraine war, second, of course, to the human catastrophe
Correct.
that has been borne
Appalling.
predominantly by Ukrainians, but also young
Yep.
Russians as well.
Yep.
War is always and everywhere a failure of democracy. It's
Yep.
just of diplomacy. I'm sorry, a failure
Yeah.
of diplomacy.
Yeah. Yeah.
The great catastrophe is we have driven Russia and China very close together.
Yep.
I think irreversibly.
Yep.
And the very molecules that used to be the underpinning of the Central Western European German manufacturing miracle, dirt cheap natural gas, reliable oil and refined products, even coal,
Mhm.
have been rerouted
Yep.
from Europe to China and India.
Yep.
So at the highest level, you have the world's second most important commodity player and the world's, at the same time, probably the world's most important net commodity exporter, Russia,
Right.
that used to be willing to reliably provide energy, which is
Yep.
life, to
Right.
Western Europe,
Yep.
in exchange for being part of the European club, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
but now you have arteries being built, mechanisms being built, settlement mechanisms in particular. But look, I mean, the hard pipelines, Power Siberia 1, let's keep an eye if Power Siberia 2 is built.
Right.
The tanker fleets that the West is now calling shadow tankers. Um, Russia's vast reservoir of really cheap oil, gas, and coal, their substantial presence in the Arctic. We have also here in the West what we call sort of techno arrogance. And not to pick on Peter Zeihan, for example, who I quite like and enjoy his content. Don't know him personally, but I quite enjoy his content. At the beginning of the war in Ukraine, there were people like him saying all kinds of things about the technical inability of the Russians to keep oil and gas flowing in the face of sanctions. And anybody who's been in industry knows that's insane talk.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Right.
the Russians are incredibly sophisticated
Yep.
technically,
Yep.
and the Chinese, having stolen everything from everybody and then taken the best of the world's technology and then improved it themselves, are vastly superior to the West in most technologies today. Like this is the big assumption that most people in the West get wrong. Like if you go to an automotive manufacturing facility in China today, the big three automakers are done. Like they're so far behind
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
what BYD can do. I mean, don't
Yep.
talk to me about Tesla and the machine
Interesting.
that builds the machine. I mean, give me a break. Go to BYD. There's a reason why Warren Buffett's in BYD and never
Interesting.
bought Tesla. So the combination of India, China. Look, I mean, I travel the world. There's a university in China that only produces petroleum engineers.
Mm.
They have 15,000 students at that university. It's an incredibly elite one, hard to get into. The U.S. produced a grand total of 600 petroleum engineers in a year,
Wow.
and half of them are foreign students.
Wow. Again, this
And
notion that China and the East are playing chess and thinking longer term
right,
than the quarter by
and
quarter, election cycle by election cycle West.
and to think that Russia was not going to be able to keep its molecules flowing because Schlumberger left town is happy talk from know nothings. I mean, it's
Yeah.
really amazing. And so what we've seen is, as we predicted, by the way, we wrote a piece in April of 2022 when the peak of the Ukrainian flags proliferating Twitter,
Right.
the peak of the media frenzy.
Yep.
We wrote a piece called Crazy Pills. where we were like, we're taking crazy pills. Like
Hmm.
these sanctions are not only going to fail, they are going to backfire.
Yeah.
I'll give you a fundamental example. Like from the commodity sector, I know one thing above all else: you make all your money on price.
Hmm.
Volume is your enemy, actually, in the
Hmm.
commodity sector. Nothing like a good shortage to make 8 years worth of profit,
Yeah.
right? Because of
Right.
the inelasticity of pricing of these critical materials. When you run short of them, prices skyrocket. You sell into that Icarus print, and you're going to make generational money, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, like, you can't sanction Russia's volume.
Right.
They will more than make it up on price. Um,
Well, it is
and
fascinating. I mean, we had written 2 years right when the sanctions began. I said the sanctions against Russia would probably be the greatest State Department failure in our history, and it would backfire immensely. And
Mhm.
it was crazy pills. Even at the War College in Carlisle, they were trying to explain that this is not going to be a long-term good for the West. It is absolutely falling into the play of pushing Russia and China closer together. And to your point, also, you look at the human costs in this backdrop. And I do want to talk about the Ukraine war in a second. Clausewitz, the Prussian militarist, famously said that war is just an extension of politics by another means. But I think in a nuclear era, that's just madness. War is a failure of politics. And the sanctions at first, not to mention the human cost that you mentioned in the Ukraine in particular, but also for Russians, is appalling. So the combination of the human cost, the moral cost, the long-term geopolitical changes in the East, and what we've done to the West to shoot ourselves in the foot with those sanctions just cannot be understated enough. And yet, as you said, it's crazy pills, and yet still being pushed by the West and certainly here in Europe as a sensible solution to solving saving democracy in the Ukraine. It is appalling to me how misunderstood this whole situation is.
Look, we've said to make a point, sometimes you have to say something outrageous.
Hmm.
It is our view that the US military should be escorting every Russian oil tanker on Earth to make sure that every single molecule of fossil fuels gets to the market as flawlessly and as cheaply as possible.
Yeah,
What we should have done, which is what James Baker did before the first Gulf War, is go around the world, talk to all the major oil producing countries who are either dependent on or allied with the US and say, we're going to flood the market.
right, right,
Russia's break-even price was $40 a barrel. Sanctions drove the price of oil above 100.
right.
So imagine a world where Biden calls all the CEOs of the major US energy companies into the Oval Office.
Yeah,
And he says, we have a national emergency. The country needs your help. By the way, these people tend to be pretty patriotic,
yeah,
last I checked. And we are going to temporarily crush the price of oil. And in return, you're going to get long-term access to leases on federal lands. And we are going to term out the refilling of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in a way that you can drill and know that in the future, you're going to more than make the cost of capital for the investments I want you and need you to make now in
right.
order to drive the price of oil down. Just the signaling power of these CEOs standing behind Biden in the Oval Office at the White House in
Right.
2022 would have
Right.
crashed the price of oil.
Right.
And if the price of oil had been crashed to $10 or $15 a barrel,
Hmm.
the war would be over.
Interesting.
It, and we didn't do that. We did the opposite of that. And so, in a world where we managed to succeed by taking 10% of Russia's exports off the market, the price of oil is going to be up by way more than 10%. They're just going
Hmm.
to have the same amount of profit and more oil to sell in the future. It's so plainly obvious to anybody. Literally, there was nobody on the Biden team that had ever worked in industry.
Well, it makes you
Uh,
wonder if maybe the Ken and Barbies were actually making the decisions in the Oval Office or the cabinet. It does, and again, it's not trying to
well,
be partisan. This is not an anti-Biden, anti-Democrat statement.
well,
It's like, what were they thinking in 2022? What were
you
they
know,
thinking?
it's funny you should say that because we were accused of being a Putin puppet
Exactly.
for pointing this out. And I
Exactly.
remember, like, no, like I'm trying to give you the plan to beat
Right.
Putin, right?
Right.
Like, in what universe is, hey, what we're going to do will fail. And if you would like to win, here's what we should do is somehow helping the enemy.
Well, that's just
So,
it. It makes you wonder if the D minus students are the quote unquote decision makers in the seminar room. I mean,
so
this
not,
is what
not,
appalls me.
not to pick on somebody, but I remember with some horror watching the infamous 60 Minutes segment where the architect of the sanctions policy was taking a victory lap. Do you remember this?
Yeah, yes. It was
It was
embarrassing.
a fellow by the name of Dalip Singh, I
Yeah,
believe.
it was embarrassing.
And he went on TV and they were, the classic sort of hero
Yeah.
fawning segment.
Yeah.
And I was blown away. And by the way, authentically 100% believed everything he was saying.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Um,
It's like
and
Bernanke getting the Nobel Prize for having a money printer and thinking that's
right,
monetary policy. The
right.
ironies keep spinning.
Yes. And I was like, we should be escorting their energy to the market. Like literally, let's like make it a serious crime to attack a Russian tanker, right?
Yeah.
Like we are going to defend. I mean, let's do the opposite experiment. Imagine if we blockaded Russia and every molecule of fossil fuels was trapped. The world would collapse.
Yep. Yep.
Like people would starve.
Yeah.
It would be a catastrophe.
Yeah. No,
So,
the truth and so much paradox here. And yet the decision makers aren't you and I, at least today. And I do want to, because you had mentioned, I mean, this is all these sanctions and these decisions all came out of this war as well. And I want to talk about that as a third kind of question or theme, this fiasco in Ukraine, this war. And I'm not alone in this. Certainly Jeffrey Sachs, Mersheimer, and others, and um, Alex Karain, a guy I really or Craner I really respect. I mean, I don't think it's being pro-Putin to say that this really was a financial and energy war and not a democratic protection narrative that's gone out in the West. Certainly here in Europe, it's almost a blasphemy to consider it anything else but protecting democracy. And this ties into a lot of the things we're talking about. But the Western narrative frames the Ukraine war as this fight for democracy, but its core, for many of us, again, the war's origins, escalation, and now crumbling Western position are making obvious headlines. And I was just on a podcast yesterday. It was a German speaking podcast, and I probably angered 90% of the audience by saying blasphemous things. Any kind of critique of Western narrative disintegrates quickly, as you said, into being as labeled a pro-Putinist or something. And I had just suggested, the possibility that Putin, his need for NATO neutrality, maybe after all made some sense. I mean, if we saw anti-ballistic missiles on the Rio Grande or up in Toronto, I think the American government would be pretty upset about that. And that was a hard thing for them to understand because Putin is just looking for Lebensraum in the West, and nothing you can say about Putin's interest has any interest to the Western media, certainly here in Europe and the left media. And I don't want to get partisan, but this this story is Putin bad, West good. And there's really no listening to or consideration of his perspective. Again, not that he is a choir boy, but these things are fairly obvious if you just try and hold two opinions at the same time. And then in this German audience, they were talking about Friedrich Merz, this new kind of coalition band-aid potential chancellor for Germany now wants to raise 500 billion euros for military support for the Ukraine and to build Germany's military. And I made the statement that, perhaps that 500 billion euros could be better spent on German infrastructure and the German economy. But since the war began in the Ukraine, we've seen some interesting changes. Nord Stream's not so mysterious destruction certainly was a direct strike on German-Russian energy ties. It made Europe more dependent on U.S. LNG, and now, Germany is 2 years into recession and burning more coal. And the sanctions we know backfired. And Moscow's redirected energy flows to China, India, and as you said, the global South. And the net result for me in Europe's self-inflicted crisis is skyrocketing energy prices here, deindustrialization, and economic stagnation. And it reminds me of a famous quote by Kissinger, who I'm not a big fan of, but he said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. And I look at how Western Europe and certainly Germany and France and in the drums out of the UK with these midgets running these governments and these band-aid coalitions are still kind of beating the war drums. But in this context, Trump's blunt admission that Ukraine has effectively lost, it exposes the failure of what I think was Biden's NATO proxy strategy. I want to ask you, Doomberg, in your mind, how much of the West's Ukraine policy was shaped by energy propaganda? And what are the consequences of Europe's energy kind of miscalculations in this whole fiasco in the Ukraine?
the propaganda, the thicket of propaganda that is befalling Europe is incomprehensible and
Yeah,
I think historic.
yeah,
Um, you said something that's very important, and I've said it on podcasts and have written it. The war is lost.
yeah,
NATO lost that war. It was a war between NATO and Russia. fought on the NATO side through a proxy.
Yep.
I don't think it's correct to call it a proxy war because Russia was directly involved.
Sure.
But it is a war between NATO and Russia, and NATO has lost that war. To say that and for that to be controversial means that the person hearing it and upset by it is only exposing themselves to standard traditional media outlets and not taking advantage of the tsunami of open source, readily available intelligence that any person with an internet connection can find and follow. We wrote a piece more than a year ago called Mapping the War, giving our subscribers their own playbook to go and find out what's actually going on in the war. And as you probably know, there's there's Ukrainian mapping projects, there's Russian mapping projects, there's mapping projects that claim to be independent. And if any of those three initiatives are, starkly different than the other two, they tend to be self-correcting ecosystem of reality and facts that you can follow the line of combat contact and see the direction of travel.
Yeah.
And for the past 15 months, the direction of travel has been one way. And by the way, the great irony or great, contradiction in these sort of fundamental beliefs that persist and permeate across Europe is Putin is going to roll on Paris if we don't stop him in Ukraine.
Right.
All right. It's been 3 years, and Putin has not yet fully taken the 4 regions that Russia, through their constitutional amendment, now claims as being part of Russia. The same people who say the war is a stalemate and that we're not losing are saying that if we give in to Putin's demands, he will then roll onto Paris.
Exactly.
Look at the map, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Putin,
Yeah.
and by the way, look at the percentage of Russian speakers in those 4 regions.
Yep.
And you could see what's going on. Now, again, those are controversial things to say. Look, Xi Jinping is a terrible man. We do lots of business with China.
Yeah.
The world is filled with terrible actors. We have plenty of them here. Look, we are unabashedly isolationist. We, the Doomberg team, our families live in the United States. Do I really care who is going to rule the predominantly Russian-speaking Donbass?
Right.
I mean, there's a war going on in the Congo right now. Tens of thousands of people are being killed.
Right.
It's not in the media. Why do I care less about that war than this war?
Precisely.
Because I'm told to care less about that war than this war.
Yeah.
I don't like to be told what to think.
Yeah.
I care about, in the following order, I care about my family, my neighborhood, my community, my region, my state, my country, and then the rest of the world, in that order. And it's a perfectly normal, rational human instinct. And to deny that, I think, is foolish. And in order to overcome that instinct of all regular humans, the media has to whip up this frenzy.
Right.
Orange man bad.
Right.
Putin is an evil dictator. Putin is Hitler.
Right. Right.
These narratives are the classic propaganda cover stories for the execution of wars. Now, I will say, again, when we wrote that, Ukraine is acting as a proxy for NATO, some of our subscribers who are probably passionate about the war, or maybe even from Ukraine, were angry at us for saying that. And my response was, you can either be angry at us labeling it what it is, or the fact that Ukraine was made a proxy.
Right.
I would think that you should be more angry at the latter.
Right.
That's the scandal.
Right.
The scandal is John McCain and Newland and the whole crowd in 2014 and getting involved right on Russia's doorstep. As you said, if Russia was launching Iskander missiles from Mexico into Colorado, I think we'd probably have something to say about that.
I think you'd be understandably upset.
Of course, right? Now, look,
that.
I mean, if you're Ukraine, what we're saying is, blasphemous. And look, I understand that. One thing that has really scared us, we did a Doom Zoom for our Pro-Tier, similar to the China one last year, called Sleepwalking into the Abyss. The hardest thing to do is lose a war.
Right.
Like, getting into war is always a tragedy. It is a ultimate failure of diplomacy.
Yeah.
Wars are won and lost on supply chains and physics. And we were never going to be able to out-supply Russia from a distance.
Right.
And by the way, we have our own huge dependencies on China, who is clearly aligned with Russia. So what is a sort of a war of proxy for us is a existential war in Russia. At
Yep.
least that's the propaganda they're telling themselves.
Hmm.
And their supply chain is right there. They're a far larger country with far more people and a far more sophisticated manufacturing sector and access to all the commodities and energy raw materials that they need. How are we going to beat Russia, as the Russians would call it, impose a strategic defeat on the Russians from
Hmm.
afar?
Right, right.
It's just never going to happen.
Well, facts are
Um,
stubborn things. It's very upsetting to hear these facts if you have a strong ideological view, Putin bad, Orange Man bad.
or if you had family members who were killed in the war, which I would totally understand and
Sure.
I would agree is tragic.
Yep.
Look, I have military age kids. I don't want them going to war.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
don't, I don't, I feel terrible for the people who have lost, who have
Right,
suffered.
right.
This is not their fault. The average Ukrainian wants to live in peace.
Yep,
The
yep.
average Canadian wants to live in peace. The average American wants to live in peace. This whole hysteria that's being whipped up in Canada over Orange Man bad is fascinating to watch. Look, I have many, many good friends in Canada, and like some of them have stopped speaking to us because we live in the U.S.
It's so polarizing. And
It's
yet, and
amazing,
yet,
you
and
know.
yet Ukraine has become a meat grinder. I was listening to Colonel Douglas McGregor when I was at a conference in Vancouver earlier this year. He's a military man. He's a colonel. I'm not saying everything is right, everything is wrong. He certainly has a perspective like you do in energy on the military that's probably better than both of us, but it's an inherently unwinnable war. And in the ratio of deaths on the Ukraine side, is appallingly higher than on the Russian side. And it's appalling that anyone is dying, as you said, at a moral level. And yet, as Jeffrey Sachs was saying in front of the European Parliament recently, Mitt Romney, my former neighbor on Beacon Hill, for God's sakes, uh, was talking about, escalating this war and supporting Zelensky. Again, it's not because it's not that we're pro-Russia here, but he made a comment. Look, if Americans are against this war, just remember, no Americans are dying. No Americans are dying, which was an appalling thing to say out loud. That, in other
Oh,
words,
yeah.
it's okay to continue to escalate this war. There's maybe a million dead Ukrainians, but it's not dead Americans. And so we should continue to support this meat grinder. And again, as your point is made, I think many Ukrainians would like to see something better than death in the Ukraine, despite the fact that they are probably going to lose this war. And when I talked to a German audience yesterday, I said mathematically, even with the alliance of France and the UK, Germany, if it spends most of its GDP on military expenditures, is not going to win a war against Russia.
Well,
And
we wrote a piece. They don't have the jewels. They were
yeah, they
like
just don't.
bombs are concentrated forms of energy.
Hmm.
Like tanks and rifles and bullets and armor all require hugely energy intensive
Right.
machines and materials that Europe is in short supply. So let's take the UK. I'm always amazed. We wrote a piece, it was a little rough on the UK. Um, the British Army has 75,000 soldiers in it. I believe they have a couple dozen operable tanks. Um, I, there's a scandal in Britain last year or the year before about the condition of the barracks for British Army soldiers. Roach infested, run down, underinvested in.
Mm.
Like the old phrase, like you and what army, right? I
Right.
mean,
Right.
Keir Starmer talks a big game, Sir Keir Starmer, I should say.
Yeah,
Um,
of course.
the last two times that a British aircraft carrier was supposed to participate in NATO exercise, they couldn't go because their propellers were broke.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like what do we do? What are we talking about? You're going to win a war. Like the most telling moment of the Trump presidency, the sort of laugh out loud moment for me at least, was when Starmer was sitting in the Oval Office and Trump says, "What? Are you going to be able to beat Russia by yourself?" And then he gives him that like, "What's with this guy pointing the thumb at him with the head shake?" You know,
Right.
and
Right.
the look on Starmer's face was like, "Oh my
Right.
God, did he just say that?" Well, that's what Trump does, right? He just says those things. But
Exactly.
like, you in what army? Like, okay, Ursula von der Leyen is going to fight and defeat Russia.
Hmm. Hmm.
By
Well,
by the Brussels bureaucracy is going to assemble a mighty European army and print the jewels to properly
Well,
arm
that's
it.
just what's so tragic. It's these platitudes replacing hard facts and simple math, whether it's, the simple math of military, the simple math of energy, the simple math of morality, I think should even be more upon them. But Keir Starmer, Frederick Merz, Ursula von der Leyen, I mean, it's very easy for them to make these political platitude statements. It's very hard for them to explain the math, let alone the human cost of this. It simply doesn't equal. It doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. And even these individuals don't really speak for the majority of Europeans. And I think that's the great irony. The insane are in charge of the asylum, so to speak. And again, that shouldn't be left or right. liberal or conservative. That should be a human question. And we should have open dialogue and discussions and debates about facts, not about partisan thoughts
Look,
or, it's
I,
appalling.
I'm old enough to remember when isolationism and anti-war thinking was considered bedrock of the weak left,
Exactly. Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
I went. My views have gone from being, red communist
Yeah.
to pro-Putinism.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Depending on who you talk to, I'm either a Nazi or a communist. It depends on my audience, but I'm just trying to
and look,
be,
this whole Chamberlain appeasement argument is based on a giant fallacy, by the way.
you know,
If the British and the French and Hitler had nuclear bombs in World War II, I don't know that World War II would have gone the way it did.
correct. Correct. Yeah.
Russia is the world's most dangerous nuclear superpower.
Hmm.
It is quite literally then impossible to win a kinetic war with Russia.
Hmm.
They have nuclear weapons to prevent losing a kinetic war. Let
Hmm.
me ask you a question. Why do people care so much about proliferation and stopping it? Very simple. Once a country has a credible nuclear threat, you have to treat them differently.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's not that
Precisely.
hard.
Precisely.
Right? And Russia has the largest and the most
Right.
sophisticated nuclear arsenal on Earth.
Hmm.
Maybe before we embark on a kinetic conflict with the world's most dangerous nuclear superpower,
Hmm.
we might want to fully exhaust all diplomatic possibilities.
Yeah, imagine that. Imagine that,
And
Doomberg.
nobody would argue that we
Hmm.
did that here.
Right.
History will not be very kind to Boris Johnson.
Hmm.
I don't believe. I think the
Yep.
Istanbul Agreement was probably the last exit ramp.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
there's two ways wars end. They end via diplomacy or they end via military imposition.
Hmm. Well, let me,
We
these are all very rational, obvious points. And again, they should be nonpartisan. They're fairly self-explanatory and self-evident. And yet, we both know whether it's markets, politics, uh, certainly human nature isn't always rational. And maybe we're chasing our own tails and expecting more people to understand it this way. And although I think we're making a difference, certainly platforms like yours are making a difference. But this brings me to another kind of question in terms of risks and game changers ahead, not just in the energy space. I mean, for example, Nord Stream was a disaster, and it's really, again, no great mystery to many. And Zelensky, as we just saw in this DC White House performance, is desperate and he's losing. We all know that. He probably knows that if he's being honest with himself or his people. And again, this shouldn't be pro Putin or anti democracy to say that. I feel my fear is that there is a risk, and I think you share this, that there's a risk of Zelensky's circle potentially going rogue. And maybe that again is a sensational statement, but as you said, no one likes to lose a war, even when it's clear that they're losing. I mean, I use history all the time. Robert E. Lee should have known the war was over at Gettysburg. The Wehrmacht was done in 43 in Stalingrad. Napoleon was pretty much done after Waterloo, but those wars continue to go on because it's very hard to admit defeat. Eh, Is there a risk in your perspective, for example, after the Nord Stream mystery, quote unquote, of a Turk Stream event, kind of Turk Stream event similar? And is it and toward that end, is there a potential energy and hence geopolitical economic risk that you are pondering in this current kind of volatile global setting that we're in? Or is that too dark and gloomy?
Oh, it's not dark at all. We predicted as much in January in another doom zoom that we did called natural gas between Russia and Europe. History, current prospects, and so on.
Mhm.
Um, Turk Stream and Blue Stream are two pipelines that go under the Black Sea into Turkey and then feed the sort of predominantly the old communist bloc of Eastern
Yeah.
Europe.
Yep.
Um, and they're the last remaining active pipeline arteries
Hmm.
that connect Russia to Europe. And
Hmm.
were they to be destroyed in the way that Nord Stream was destroyed, a real whodunit, I must say,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Real. Yeah.
that would be a catastrophe for Europe. In fact, it's the subject of our next piece called Dead of Winter,
Hmm.
assessing the prospects of another European energy crisis because their natural gas tanks are almost empty right now,
Hmm.
and they have to begin the refilling season. And unlike prior years, the only gas flowing via pipeline is through Turkey now, much to the thrill of Erdogan.
Hmm.
The those links, when you talk about Ukraine going rogue, look, it is really hard to lose a war. Zelensky is many things, um, but you can't help but at least understand his predicament.
Hmm.
Um, you go from the hero of the collective West to Trump and him getting into an argument in the Oval Office. That's not a fun journey.
Right.
Um, and it's not fun to lose wars. And again, like if you follow the mapping projects, you could see what's going on in this war.
Hmm.
Um, and so, Europe, we watched with great interest this pipeline operation in Kursk. Not to get too much into the details, but sometimes the details inform the
Hmm.
broad, right?
Hmm.
So, depending on which side you believe, Russian special forces either pulled off like the most daring and cunning assault ever by walking several hundred, as many as 800 special forces and other troops through the old Susa pipeline and magically showing up behind energy lines and creating chaos, or they sacrificed hundreds of elite soldiers in what amounts to a publicity stunt. It doesn't really
Hmm.
matter to me which side you believe.
Hmm.
What we see in that operation is critical energy arteries not only being destroyed, Nord Stream, but now being used as cover for assaults. And that is a dangerous escalation from an energy
Right.
perspective.
Right.
And
Right.
in the immediate aftermath of that, you had this reporter with a big Twitter following from Build saying that we should blow up all the connections between Russia and Europe so that they can't use them as weapons. I mean, it's a
Hmm.
silly thing to say. This
Yep.
particular pipeline is the largest in the world and
Hmm.
is one of the few that a human could actually safely walk through.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, we can think of no stronger metaphor for the dissolution of the energy relationship between Russia and Europe than that.
Yep.
And we're publishing on it soon. The TLDR of our piece is that Europe will probably be able to muddle through one more year, and then they'll be fine because there's a glut of LNG coming on the market.
Hmm.
But still, I mean, what a failure.
Yeah.
A literal pipeline that used to be a bedrock of German manufacturing
Right.
is
Right.
now nothing more than cover for special forces in a war.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
crazy.
And
Um,
it is somewhat dark. It doesn't mean it's inevitable, but this kind of, as we're talking about potential, not even black swans, gray swans, or risks ahead, and you want to hope you're wrong, but when you look at the world realistically, maybe somewhat, I admit, maybe too cynically, when you start to understand history and economics and human nature more than just market moves. I mean, when you've got blunt-minded instruments making decisions, with a lack of what I think Luke Roman would call second derivative thinking, no ability to think beyond the first domino, just thinking one domino at a time. And to this theme we've talked about, where it's hard to lose, it's hard to admit a loss of a war, it's hard to admit defeat, it's even harder to surrender power. And if you take this kind of cynicism one step further, crisis is opportunity. When I think of how men like Keir Starmer or Friedrich Merz or women like Ursula von der Leyen or even Zelensky or the military industrial complex as a whole, um, these type of individuals and groups don't like to admit defeat, and they certainly don't like to surrender power. Would it be beyond the stretch of imagination? And again, hoping I'm wrong, Hemingway famously said, when you're debt strapped, your two solutions are debasing your currency and distracting the people with war. In a nuclear era, this becomes preposterous. But um, if they really see the writing on the wall, not just in the Ukraine and not just Zelensky's power, but even Keir Starmer or Merz or others, these kind of bureaucrats who kind of a parasitic overlay over the European Union or community in Brussels, is it so hard to admit defeat and humbly walk away, or will they not admit defeat and create more crisis, more war, more distraction? That to me is harder to do in a nuclear era with an informed population. And I
It's
guess,
also it's also all being driven by people who are wildly unpopular.
ironically, isn't that the great irony of all?
Yeah, didn't mean to cut your question off, but yeah,
No,
so look at Keir Starmer, his approval ratings, the
yeah,
great landslide that he won, 30,
exactly,
34% of the vote.
exactly,
Macron, the least popular politician in Europe, who elected Ursula von der Leyen? Nobody.
exactly,
So
exactly.
one of the big test cases earlier this year was in Georgia, the country, not the state, and the failed color revolution in Georgia. And I note with interest that the outgoing president, who claims that she was taking the dignity of the office with her, the prestige of the office with her, ended
Mhm.
up as a Henry Kissinger Fellow at the John McCain Institute. I'm not making that
You
up,
can't make this stuff up. You really
right?
can't.
And so they failed there. Now the next big test is Romania.
Yeah.
And I think what's going on in Romania is a scandal of epic proportions.
Yeah. Yeah.
The word democracy has undergone such a fantastic semantic shift in Europe that it is meaningless. The word democracy is meaningless.
Hmm. Hmm.
And if they succeed in Romania, they'll keep the game going for a little while.
Hmm.
But if they fail in Romania, I think all bets are off, which is why they're going to the
Yeah.
mattresses.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Romania is the linchpin for freedom in Europe. I think J.D. Vance's speech was 100% correct.
Hmm.
Give
Hmm.
him full credit and for the courage to say it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I know it came as a shock to many Europeans.
Yeah. Imagine
Um,
that. Yep.
I think what's going on in the UK is deeply scandalous.
Yep.
And none
Agreed.
of these people have popular support for their. If you turn off the media propaganda machine,
There's nothing there.
you'll find out that 90% of the people believe what we believe.
Well, that's what's interesting, and maybe this is a good way to tie up this conversation where we began, Doomberg. We finished where we began in the sense of, you know, where do we start in the sense that we talked about monopolization of information. I mean, the famous quote by I think it was Baron von Rothschild: to "Give me the control of the money, it matters not who's in power. And if you give me control of information and the money, that's incredible power. But the power to control the information through the mainstream medias of these different blocks is getting lesser and lesser because of alternative media. And alternative media has the good, the bad, and the ugly. You have to be very careful, and you have to be selective in that as well. But I think, without flattering you, platforms like yours and other platforms that are on the Internet of Things, so to speak, where you can get alternative information. Again, alternative doesn't always mean correct, but there's far more fair and open debate, dialogue, and discussion on your platform, for example, than there is on CNBC or Fox News. And there's more serious scholarship, perspective, and years spent in an industry or in an area, whether it's the military, whether it's energy, whether it's the markets, whether it's central banking, where people are less constrained and more free to exhibit their perspective. And hopefully, if more and more citizens of the world get their information from people who are actually veterans of that space and who can think more objectively and clearly and soberly and unemotionally about any, whether it's gold, whether it's precious metals, whether it's currency risk, whether it's energy, whether it's geopolitics. Um, I think the days of great debate in the public space have ended in the mainstream, and they're now finding their way onto platforms like yours. And again, it's not meant to flatter, but that there is some hope in that. It's a seismic shift in changing perceptions, whether it's in Germany or whether it's in the UK or whether it's in Macron's France or Trump's America or Biden's America, however you want to break it down. I'm hopeful and maybe naive, despite a extreme amount of cynicism that I've acquired in my life, in my elitist education and Wall Street background, is that, you know, there is a chance actually to hold two different opinions at the same time. There is a chance to get past partisanship, and there is a chance to become informed rather than emotional. And that's hard work, but it's worth it. And that if you can find your information on credible platforms through credible voices, that maybe from the bottom up we can make change instead of waiting to come from the top down, which, as you and I have kind of hinted, the top down is not without some great exceptions. A lot of is a circus of clowns, and that circus of clowns has been making decisions poorly for too long. And hopefully the changes, and again, not Trump is going to solve everything, and Tulsi Gabbard is better than everything else. So I certainly prefer Tulsi Gabbard over her predecessor, and I actually know her, and I think she's sincere. It doesn't mean I'm pro-Trump and anti-left. It just means we've got to get brighter, smarter, more honest people in there, whether in politics or on the information stage. And that's why I really thank you for your perspectives today that we can share with our limited gold audience, but it's still, we're all affected by these forces of geopolitics and energy and certainly currency risk and banking risk and the things that we talk about more so than energy. But this is a fantastic perspective. And I think we're all kind of looking in the same direction, just at different bellwethers. But I really, really appreciate your time today. And I'll leave it to you if you have any final thoughts.
I'll say, look, we're in our line of business, and a quick way to grow an audience is to what we call engagement harvest. We would
Mhm.
view that as a sugar high. It's not really sustainable. The only sustainable way to build an audience, like we've tried to do, is to always tell the truth as you believe it in the moment.
Right.
That is our brand promise
Yep.
to our subscribers. And look, we're not afraid to annoy some of them when we think that they're off base. Many of our subscribers, for example, tend to be long energy stocks, and we put out a piece a year and a half ago called "Pea Cheap Oil is a Myth."
Hmm.
It annoyed a bunch of people. It's reality. That piece has borne has aged well.
Yeah.
We would
Yeah.
rather be right
Yeah.
than temporarily big.
Right.
And our view is the integral of being correct is the only sustainable way to grow an information business. We're
Yep.
not always right.
Right.
Another big aspect of our brand is when we admit when we're wrong. Our
Hmm.
rule is very simple. Mistakes should be rare, admitted to, corrected, and learned from.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not that hard.
Yeah.
And so we are at Doomberg.com. Anybody listening who's interested to find out more, we publish around 8 articles a month. And then our pro tier is those articles plus a monthly webinar where we do a deep dive like the ones I've described here. Really great talking to you. I enjoyed the conversation. We went down a lot of holes that I've given a lot of thought to. So I very much enjoyed it.
Well, I equally for myself, and again, I think that's a very good point to make. Truth is an elusive term from philosophy to markets, but honesty isn't. Just speak your honest opinions. If you're wrong, be accountable. That shouldn't be too hard to do. It's very hard to see among central bankers and politicians. Every now and then there's an exception, but it's been an absolute pleasure, Doomberg, swapping thoughts with you today, and I really appreciate it.
Looking forward to the next time.
All right, buddy. Take care.